We've all know the importance of the old ABCs. The new ABCs are attention, balance, and compassion. And they do bring a whole nother layer of emotional intelligence and academic intelligence and social intelligence into the educational sphere. And we know from Daniel Goleman's work that emotional intelligence, or EQ, is often more important than IQ as far as being able to navigate the working world.
Namaste. You're listening to the Savannah Podcast. Join us on an exploration of Eastern spirituality, yoga philosophy, and conscious living for the new age. This podcast is a production of SavannahSpirit.com, the best place to shop for unique clothing, spiritual handcrafted jewelry, healing gemstones, and fair trade gifts from the Far East. Now, here's your host, Brett Larkin.
Friends, welcome back to the Savannah Podcast. Thank you so much for being here and for listening. If you haven't joined our Facebook group, savannaeast.com/group will redirect you to our private community, and I would love to approve you and have you there with us so we can connect and talk more about the show. Now, some of you may have seen my big YouTube video announcement that I'm having my first child, my first baby, later this year. And I couldn't be more excited for today's guest because in that video, I talked about how this new little being in my life, I'm planning for them to be this huge mindfulness and meditation teacher to me, because of course it's easier to get up early and have this beautiful meditation practice that I do without kids. But I know that is all going to change soon. And I'm in such admiration of all of you listeners who already are parents. So if that's you, or if you just have young people in your life, you are going to love today's episode. We have a special guest who I can't wait to talk to. Her name is Susan Kaiser Greenland. She's an internationally recognized leader in teaching mindfulness and meditation to children, teens, and parents. She's played a foundational role in making mindfulness practices specifically appropriate for young people, and she's really helped pioneer activity-based mindfulness with her first book, Mindful Child, and her second book, Mindful Games, which I can't wait to hear about because I want to know what a mindful game is. And Susan speaks very widely at prestigious institutions and meditation centers around the US and abroad, and today she's all ours. So Susan, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
Oh, I'm so excited to connect with you.
And congratulations on the new baby.
Thank you. I'm super excited and terrified. So I know you're going to give me so much good advice.
How do you feel?
I feel fantastic. I feel like I've had a very, very easy pregnancy, probably very much due to diet and yoga and all those good things. So I feel lucky. And I know that you are a parent as well, and that you have a past. This is kind of where I wanted to start with you. You have a past as a corporate lawyer and then changed to teaching mindfulness to kids. And I was wondering if you could just tell us about that, because I want to learn a little bit more about you before we dive in. And was that sort of a transition that you made when you had children, or your kids were at a certain age, or you saw something specifically going on with your dynamic with your kids?
Yeah, my kids now are 26 and 23 years old. So, but I'm lucky. Both of them are nearby. They're in Los Angeles. So it's nice to have the whole family kind of within a reasonable driving distance. It's Los Angeles, so it's still 30 minutes or so, but it's great to have them close by. And yeah, I was a corporate lawyer. I'm not one of those people who hated practicing law. I actually loved practicing law. And I think the law practice, the almost 20 years of law practice I had, really, really helped me in developing the secular programs that I've created with mindfulness and meditation for kids and adults, mostly caregivers. But I was practicing law. I had a lot of stress in my life. I had found that meditation helped me. My first interest in meditation was really one for stress reduction. And then soon I learned that it would help with emotional healing. And so then I was on the path for emotional healing. And then ultimately I realized that it could lead to some sort of psychological freedom. And that's the path I then became, was on and am on today. But in that journey, I started wondering whether the same practices and activities that had helped me as an adult could help my kids, who at the time were probably around 3 and 5 or 6. Then there was really nothing out there for kids. John and Mila Kabat-Zinn's book, Everyday Blessings, hadn't yet been published. I think they were writing it at the time, but it hadn't yet been published. I went on the internet and all I could find was one guided meditation for kids that had something to do with a dolphin. And I decided to try to start adapting the practices that I had been taught as an adult to make them appropriate for my kids. And that was the beginning of a very long journey that continues to this day. That was close to 20 years ago now.
Wow. So how did that unfurl? I mean, did you just start practicing and trying different games and things with your children at home? Or did you start sort of more from an analytical perspective, sort of doing more research? Or how did this come about?
Well, you got to remember I was a lawyer, so I attacked it as if I was studying for the bar exam. I went and I got every possible book on the subject of all different sorts of adult meditation methods, even methods that I wasn't learning myself in my own study at the time with a American teacher who was trained in Tibetan Buddhism. And then I took John Kabat-Zinn's MBSR training with Saki, a week-long retreat up in Mount Madonna. I listened to and I studied with the wonderful teachers Jack Kornfeld and Joseph Goldstein and Sharon Salzberg, who were in a different tradition than the one I was being trained. And I just started pulling a little bit from all sorts of different places and trying them out, mostly with my son, who unfortunately, for better or worse, was the guinea pig at the time because he was a little younger than my daughter. And I think the best story of that time was I was very serious about my meditation practice. So I would get up at 5:30 every morning and come upstairs in our house, and we had 2 small bedrooms and the kids were little, so they were sharing one room, and the room next to it was one that we were using as kind of a home office. And I would go into that home office room and I would meditate myself every morning at 5:30 for 45 minutes. And my son, who at that time was in preschool, would somehow come around and find his way in the room with me. And I thought, because I didn't know much about child development at that time. Remember, I'm a new mom and a lawyer, but I hadn't really done much studying on child development. I thought, he wants to meditate. So I got him a rubber duck because there was really, like I said, there's no meditation and kids stuff out there, and a pillow because there weren't any kids meditation pillows at that time, cushions. And I put the duck and the pillow next to me, and I thought he was meditating. Now, later I learned a lot more about attachment theory, and he knew his mom was next door, and he was more coming to be with me. But that became a beautiful morning ritual, and then he would sit and he would look at the duck, and I got a rubber frog later, and he looked at that until he kind of toppled over and would fall asleep in my lap, and I'd finish my meditation. But that was the beginning of it. And then from there, I would try different types of things and see how they worked. But I really learned early on that activity-based mindfulness was the way to go with kids. And over these 20 years, I now have come to learn that activity-based mindfulness is a very, very powerful practice for all ages, including adults.
I really want you to define that word for me and the listeners, activity-based mindfulness. What's coming to mind for me is I know a lot of people in my community love those like coloring books, where you color beautiful designs of Buddha or something. Is that what you mean by activity-based mindfulness, just doing like a repetitive, calming task?
That would be one example of it. But the other examples of activity-based mindfulness can be introspective practices that don't include a task really, but something where you do some sort of like a zip up you zip yourself up, you play a little bit of Simon Says, all without really using many words, and you end with 30 seconds to a minute of still time where you're feeling your breathing. So integrating short periods of quiet and introspective practice where you're listening to a sound or feeling the sensations of your feet against the floor or feeling your breathing together with an activity really is very helpful, because the activity helps loosen everything up and helps kids get a little bit of the energy out, through some physical movement before they try to settle. And you start building those activities one after another, so you can do several of them in a row, and you end up getting a much longer period of introspection than you can if you ask a child just to sit quietly for 5 minutes or 6 minutes.
So it's sort of like you're alternating doing a game, like Simon says, something that would maybe typically associate with a children's game, but then adding in some mindfulness practices at the end and then doing a different type of game. So it's sort of like an alternating.
Yeah, it's a little like, and I don't know a lot about yoga, but they're asanas, right? It's a little bit like you put together a series of, is asana, am I pronouncing that right?
No, you are. And it's what came to mind for me too, because some people, most Savannah listeners know, but many people don't know that the physical asana practice is designed to help us sit still and meditate, right? That's the reason you do a physical practice. So it makes perfect sense that with little ones, especially who have a lot of energy, that you'd want them to be doing something physical that helps them release energy before you ask them to quiet down.
Yeah, that's how it works. And then you can also pretty quickly, once the game is established and the kids know the game, so the Simon Says you're talking about, you can do games that you really don't need to use any words for. So where they're basically following your lead, putting their hands on their heads, on their shoulders, on their tummy, one hand on their nose or something. So they're still attending to you. It's quiet. There's no words. So you can get into a nonverbal kind of attuned communication. It's so much fun that way, and it's pretty cool.
So hearing your story about you meditating in the morning and your son joining you is just so beautiful. And of course, I think that's a big fantasy for me, but it reminded me of an anecdote that came up in one of my Facebook groups where this mother shared with the group. She said that she has 3 children and, their mornings are just chaotic and her 3 kids are just screaming at each other and at her. And she was really asking the yoga community, what can I do? She just felt so overwhelmed. And I think one of the things I've heard you talk about in the past, that this mindful practice needs to start with the parents, or it needs to be something that the parents are practicing first. I'd love for you to tell us more about that, and then hear, what advice do you have for someone like her, or for any of the parents out there who are just like, yeah, this sounds great, but I don't know if you know what, my kitchen's like in the morning with my 3 kids throwing food at me.
Yeah, no, and I'm going to start with the advice piece, which is to, first of all, take a deep breath and realize this is just normal. I mean, it's this is what getting up in the morning is like. And I remember it so well, especially if you have 2 working parents, which we did at home, and then 2 kids who were often in different carpool time lines at different times. And we were not as much as we wanted to be, we were not the working family couple who had everything packed and by the door the night before. I know that that's what we were supposed to do, and I imagine it would have been easier if we had, but we had so much going on that there was always this last minute rush to get out the door. And what we started to do really early on is to stop just before we left the door, just before we opened that door, and try to take 3 deep breaths, 3 purposeful breaths together. And that had a way of just bringing everything down and grounding us, so that when we then walked out to the car, it wasn't just a continuation of that kind of perpetual motion around the house. But yeah, I mean, it's hectic and it's chaotic, and that is just part and parcel of what it's like. And part of learning to deal with that is learning to let go a little bit around it, and also learning to be able to interject in the course of it pauses and easy ways to do mindful pauses, whether it's ringing a bell and everybody stops and kind of catches their breath, whether it's taking 3 deep breaths before you leave the door, whether it's shaking up a snow globe or some glitter ball, or snow globes are easier to get now, and saying, hey, this is what mommy's mind feels like right now. Can you help me for a second? And let's just all calm down and watch the snow settle and take a few breaths. These kind of things help interrupt that that cycle that just gets faster and faster and faster unless if you interrupt it. You can't really, it's not necessarily realistic to stop it entirely because you got to get out of the house and there's a lot to do. But you can drop in brief moments of mindful reminders and mindful interrupters to interrupt that hectic routine. But I think your first question was starting with the parents, and it's so true. And it's something that parents sometimes understandably are confused about, because parents will say to me, hey, I don't need to learn how to play the piano for my kids to learn to play the piano. I can hire a piano teacher and they get something out of it and they can become great pianists, but I don't need to learn in order for them to do it. And so it's hard sometimes for people new to mindfulness and meditation to understand what's different about this practice as opposed to other things that we can take kids to learn, whether it's soccer, whether it's a sport, whether it's a musical instrument. And the difference is that kids learn more from our example than from anything we tell them. So if we are running way faster than our regular rev could be, if we are reactive rather than responsive, if we are unable to ground ourselves and settle our minds and body, then how can we expect the kids to be able to do it? Because they're following our lead. And so our best way of teaching is to model this just in our way of being around them. And that doesn't mean we're going to be perfect people or perfect parents. I mean, I don't think that exists. But it does mean that when we notice we're getting a little bit out of whack, that we're able to stop, mention to our kids, okay, mommy's feeling a little bit like she needs some breathing right now, or like she needs to look at the snow globe settle, or like she needs to listen to some sounds, and model for them how we use mindfulness-based activities to help us calm down when we're overly excited or upset, help us see things more clearly, and develop more attention, balance, and compassion.
So I'm thinking about this in terms a little bit, because of course I'm a yoga person, in terms of energy, right? It's like if the parent has that energy of calm or mindfulness, and I'd love to hear your personal definition of mindfulness in a moment, but it's like kids are very receptive and porous, and they can potentially pick up on that. So again, I love the story of you meditating and your son joining you. I mean, he joined you, but he didn't start jumping up and down. He sort of sat quietly next to you, perhaps because he could sense intuitively that you were in a space of quiet and he wanted to match your vibration or energy, if, I can put it in those terms.
Well, if you just look at it also just from a, parenting kind of perspective, between the ages of 0 to 18 months, child and parent, or child and adult caregiver, absolutely co-regulate each other. The nervous system of the adult will be picked up by the nervous system of the child. And similarly, the nervous system of the child, if the child starts getting worked up, can be just picked up by the adult. And what we have to do as adults is realize, okay, I'm not going to let my nervous system join with this child's nervous system and escalate like this. Instead, I'm going to try to counter that by being calm, and hopefully the child's nervous system will join with mine and de-escalate that way. So absolutely, there's an element of, and then even after 18 months, it happens, throughout the lifespan. I mean, how many times have you sat in a room and been calm and like reading a book or writing a letter or doing or cooking or whatever it is you're doing, and having somebody come in like a hurricane from the outside, and you actually feel that heightened nervous system response. You start to pick up on it. And so, yeah, I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah, and even as an adult, I know, if my mom's crying, like I start to tear up, it's just, I think it's that deep connection. Tell us about your definition of mindfulness, because I know it's a word that gets used a lot now, whether it's, the yoga community or the meditation community. And I'd love to hear sort of how you define it in this context of your work with kids and teens.
Yeah, well, I think mindfulness has developed a couple definitions now just through the course of its popularization. And it's easy to try to, purists will try to keep it to one very specific definition, but that's not very helpful to your listeners or to the people that I work with when they're hearing the word mindfulness referencing very different things. So I talk about mindfulness now that the definition has evolved kind of into two general definitions. One is the classical definition of mindfulness, which is a stance of attention. In the classical languages of Sanskrit and Pali, mindfulness can be literally interpreted to mean to remember or to take heed. And so it's really to remember where your mind is, to keep track of where your mind is, or knowing what you're paying attention to, when you're paying attention to that, and your state of mind. So knowing that you're alert and that you feel alert and that your mind is on a chosen object. Right now, my mind is very much on my conversation with you, but I've noticed even in this conversation a couple of times my mind has wandered. So just keeping track of where your mind is. So that doesn't mean that your mind has to be focused on a chosen object. That's a particular type of concentration practice. It means just knowing where your mind is. And so one of the oldest meditation practices is also one of the simplest. It's when you're sitting, just sit. When you're walking, just walk. So that is really a classical mindfulness practice. The well-known and the best-known definition of that type of mindfulness comes from the MBSR program, which John Kabat-Zinn created maybe 40 years ago now. And that is paying attention on purpose without judgment. So really paying attention on purpose without analyzing what you're paying attention to at the time, but just really being with what's happening in the moment. There's always time to come back and analyze or think about what happened later.
Paying attention without judgment. I love that.
Yeah, paying attention on purpose without judgment. But what has happened is that mindfulness has become popular and mindfulness has become buzzword for all sorts of things. So I call that kind of an capital M type of mindfulness. It's more of a way of being in the world. And that way of being in the world is really to navigate the world with attention, balance, and compassion. So I make that distinction so people know whether people are talking about mindfulness as a way of being or mindfulness as a stance of attention. And that's important because when you read about it, sometimes it's talked about differently. And then I think it's important in any of these definitional conversations or discussions to also define meditation. And as you know, there are many, many meditation traditions and probably as many definitions of meditations as there are traditions. But I like to use a definition that comes out of the Tibetan tradition. In Tibetan, in the Tibetan language, the word for meditation means familiarization. So to acquaint yourself or to familiarize yourself or to get to know your mind by working with it directly. So that's how I define meditation, ways that we can get to know our minds by working with them directly. And one of the ways we do that is through mindfulness meditation. But there are many types of meditation, and mindfulness meditation is not the only one.
Beautiful. I think for most of our listeners, and I know for me it's obvious, it's like, I want to have a mindful child and incorporate all of this, but I don't want us to skip over what I know is some very interesting science that I know you've talked about in the past. Of course, I know you're not a scientist, but that there has been some intel on sort of how mindfulness can impact children's brains and brain development, or even if we don't know exactly, just extrapolating from adult research that there's been some really interesting discoveries there. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I think it's very important whenever we talk about research, whether we're scientists or not, and I'm not a scientist, but some scientists do fall into this trap of overemphasizing what the research says. And that doesn't take anything away from the research. It just means that the research is still coming along, especially in the area of kids. But even in the area of adults, the research is still being developed. That said, we've got an awful lot to be excited about and to extrapolate from for the kids' work, and also to take to heart from the adults' research. And I think with respect to kids, very often, though research showing the development of executive function and the improvement of executive functioning through the practice of mindfulness meditation is very encouraging. Of course, it's not the only way to develop attention and to develop executive function. But it is one way that it looks like this does help kids in the development of their attention and their self-regulation and their ability to hold back and exercise restraint, to control their bodies and to control their voices. It also is showing, a lot of other health benefits with respect to adult research, with respect to the immune system, with respect to emotional regulation. So there's a lot happening in the mindfulness research world and the meditation research world that does support this work. And of course, the purpose of the research isn't just to help us convince people that mindfulness is a good idea or that meditation is a good idea. The ultimate and the real deep purpose of this research is to help program providers integrate the research findings into what we're developing so that we're able to create the most helpful options for people to use when they're looking for ways to better navigate the ups and downs of daily life.
We're talking about the ups and downs of daily life. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the current education system, because I know for me and so many people who either do my teacher trainings or I connect with through yoga, we so often say, like, I wish I had this information sooner, right? When I was younger or when I was in school, or it's so exciting to me that a lot of this, whether it's yoga or mindfulness or some of the techniques that you're writing about in your books, are being taught and children are being exposed to these ideas when they're so young. Because our education system, our traditional education system, doesn't really do that. Can you tell us what your findings have been and how you're working to bring this into schools and what that looks like?
Yeah, I think, again, the research is basically the same thing I was telling you before. We're getting more research all the time, and it's very encouraging, but we keep moving forward, and we need to keep moving forward as we develop programs and are in conversation with researchers. But the work in schools is work that really is a great complement to other social emotional learning programs that are already in place. And what it does is it really helps kids learn to integrate brief moments and their teachers, and the other way around. The teachers learn to do this for themselves, and the teachers learn self-care, which actually helps avoid teacher burnout. And to integrate brief moments of mindfulness throughout the regular day and put it into their routine. So again, whether it's through activities, so for example, games like balloon arms, where you put where kids sync their breath to the movement of their arms and then sync their movement of their arms to each other, again in silence. These types of things can be dropped into transitions while you're standing in line at lunch, while you're waiting for the specialist teacher to come in. And so using transitions or using times that are already in your regular routine, whether it's the circle time in the morning or a school assembly, using those times to drop in moments of mindfulness is really, for me, the most effective way of bringing this work into the schools.
You have something called the new ABCs. You want to tell us about that?
Yeah, I think we've all know the importance of the old ABCs. The new ABCs are attention, balance, and compassion. And they do bring a whole nother layer of emotional intelligence and academic intelligence and social intelligence into the educational sphere. And we know from Daniel Goleman's work that emotional intelligence, or EQ, is often more important than IQ as far as being able to navigate the working world.
Tell us a little bit about the emotional part of the brain as compared to the problem-solving part of the brain, and what that looks like in maybe both kids and eventually adults as well.
Well, that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about how to use mindfulness and why mindfulness is really helpful to help us regulate our own nervous system and also to better understand other people's behavior through the lens of their nervous system. And one of the things that the research has really done for us is help us understand how specific techniques of purposeful breathing or moving our attention away from what we're thinking about into a present moment experience can really help downregulate the nervous system. So an easy way to think about this is that we have a thinking brain or a problem-solving part of our brain, and that's the part of our brain that does just that. It thinks and it solves problems. And there's more of an emotional part of the brain, which is a more reactive part of the brain, which protects us from danger. And what's happened in our regular life right now is that we are under so much stress as adults, and then also some kids, that emotional part of the brain is reacting through to non-threatening life events as if they're threatening. And so Rick Hansen calls that life on simmer, when we're kind of always in a mildly activated fight, flight, or freeze response. And that response is designed to shut down the thinking part of the brain so that that emotional or feeling part of the brain can take over and get us out of trouble. And it makes a lot of sense. If you think of yourself standing over a kitchen stove, and if you accidentally it's a gas stove, you accidentally have the flame on and your hand accidentally gets caught in that flame, you don't want to sit there and think, oh, should I take my hand out of the flame, or would it be better to keep it here? Your body just jerks back and reacts. That is a reactive response based on an emergency. But what happens in a lot of the social problems or the other stress problems that we have, or in a work relationship or a school relationship or a sibling or family argument, is that stress response comes in, shuts down that problem-solving part of our brain when we need it the most. Once we learn to identify that in ourselves, if we start looking at our own behavior through that lens of the nervous system, what's happening in our nervous system now, and once we identify that in other people, if we start looking at other people's behavior through the lens of what's happening in their nervous system right now, we can identify whether or not that person is in a position that they are open, receptive, and ready to learn. Because when that reactive, more emotional part of the brain shuts off that problem-solving part of our brain, we are not open, we're not receptive, we're not able to think through problems, we're not ready to learn. But when that emotional brain is back calmed down, we then are in a place where we can actually listen to each other and reason things out. So if we see that our other people's nervous system is on high alert, or if we feel it in ourselves and we recognize this is not a good time to try to think something through, then we're able not to try to talk through that problem, but use a mindfulness-based strategy, stopping and feeling our breathing, feeling the bottoms of our feet against the ground, even something like a worry stone or a stress ball, moving our attention away from worrying about what's on our mind to just squeezing that ball. Those things have a way of down regulating our nervous system and getting us back into a place where our thinking brain can do its job and we're open, we're receptive, and ready to learn. I have to tell you, you said earlier that you hear this a lot in your groups, if we only knew this at a younger age. I wish I understood this well, early in my marriage, early as a mom. If I had only then been able to look and say, oh boy, my partner or those kids or my colleagues at work, this is not a good time to try to talk through this problem with them because their nervous system is on high alert, and then come back and try to reason with them later. I would have saved myself an awful lot of time and aggravation.
Timing is everything in many things in life. I would love for you to leave us with just a couple really practical tips, which I think you've done a great job sort of sprinkling through. I think I have a sense of what some of these are, and I definitely am going to help people. We'll direct them to your books and how they can get more connected with your work at the end of the show. But would you be willing to share with us just sort of 3 things that parents of either young or, young children or kids can just maybe do now at home to start integrating some of these principles?
Yeah, well, you said 3 things. So the first thing that comes to mind is there's a couple of games, and all these games are not just in my Mindful Games book, and then there's another game called The Mindful Child, but there's a set of activity cards that is a companion piece to this book where these games are, you can just pull out a card and do them. There's a couple of games about 3 things, and one of them is 3 good things. And it's a wonderful game that I learned from a meditation teacher of my own many, many years ago ago named Yvonne Rand, who was in the Zen tradition. And that activity is just when something lousy happens, whether it's you spill juice on the table or somebody or the dishwasher isn't working or something like that, you recognize the bad thing that happens. So it's not like we're pretending everything is good. It's not like we're sweeping difficult feelings under the rug. So you recognize the difficulty, and then you say really quickly 3 things that are good in your life right now. So, oh, I know that really feels rotten right now that you just spilled that orange juice. I'm going to wipe it up, but you tell me 3 good things right now. And the 3 good things might be, well, I still have my pancakes here that I'm eating. I'm looking forward to the birthday party this afternoon. And I am happy to be hanging out with my sister today. So the idea is not to close down the problem or pretend the problem doesn't exist, but open up the view to include the difficulties as well as the positives. And that starts to help with developing this more open and receptive worldview that is so much a part of the mindfulness piece, because we've spent a lot of time in this conversation about stress management and the use of mindfulness to help with attention and regulation. But I think really the most powerful piece of this practice is how we use it to develop a more open and a kinder and a more compassionate and open-minded worldview. So the 3 good things is one good way to do that. Then another way to do that with 3 things is 3 things we have in common. So if your child comes home or is in the back seat and is telling you something about something that happened at school and somebody who's getting on his or her nerves, you listen, you acknowledge the feeling. Yeah, it sounds like that really is irritating what he or she just did. And can you think of 3 things you have in common with him or her too? And again, that has a way of not shutting down the difficulty, of acknowledging the difficulty and helping the child feel heard around the difficulty, but at the same time widening the view to say, okay, this is difficult, but let's think of things that you guys do have in common, even though this is an area of difference. So those are 2 ideas that come to mind. And both of those have more to do with the worldview than the self-regulation. The third one, I think, is a great one because it has to do with both the worldview and also with the self-regulation piece. And that's about taking a gratitude walk. And one of the things that we do know is helpful when somebody's nervous system is overly excited or upset. And remember, I always use overly excited because it doesn't only have to be lousy things that are going on that somebody can be upset or worried about. Sometimes our nervous systems get overly excited because we're so excited about something, we're so excited about something good that's happening, but still the nervous system can get on a high rev. So something like a gratitude walk where you move between 2 objects or maybe between the kitchen table and the front door. And each time you take a step, you say out loud or silently, depending on the age of the child, one thing you're grateful for. So I am grateful for the food on the table. I am grateful for the play date today. I am grateful that I get to go swimming this afternoon. I am grateful for my little sister. And that has a way, the movement piece has a way of helping us regulate, and the gratitude piece has a way of reminding us of the good things in our lives.
Thank you so much for sharing those. I love it. And I will definitely be getting your book. Tell listeners how they can best connect with you, both online and about the material and literature you have out there on this.
Oh, well, thank you. Well, I have a website. It's called SusanKaiserGreenland.com. And you can get to the same website with InnerKids.com, which is the model of the Mindfulness and Meditation for Kids program that I've developed. And on that website, there's all sorts of resources from video to audio. And then there's 3 other ways you can you can find my work in addition to social media, which I'll say later. I've got a couple books out, The Mindful Child and Mindful Games. And there's that cool set of activity cards that goes with mindful games that I did with Annika Harris, who's a wonderful meditation teacher and editor here in town. And there's also an app now that's out that's called Stop, Breathe, Think Kids. And many of the mindful games are on that app. And I collaborated with the Stop, Breathe, Think people for that. And there's a free version. And you can find all of that through the website. And then, of course, I'm on Twitter at Susan K. Greenland. And there's a Facebook page, a couple of them, Susan Kaiser Greenland and also Inner Kids. I think that's about it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being with us. Listeners, are you a parent? Do you want to chat about today's show with me? Make sure to join the Facebook group, savannaheast.com/group. And remember, your ratings and reviews here on iTunes mean the world to me. So if you haven't yet taken a moment to give the show a quick rating or review, we would love it if you would do that right now. It would really mean a lot. That helps get the show in front of more people like you who are looking to transform their life through yoga, meditation, and mindfulness. Be sure to let me know what you thought of today's episode. So much love from my heart to yours. Namaste.
You've been listening to the Savannah Podcast. To find out more about Savannah, go to savannahspirit.com or follow Savannah on Facebook at facebook.com/Savannah Spirit. For daily inspiration, check out our blog at savannaheast.com. Be sure to join us next week for a new episode, and thank you for listening to the Savannah Podcast.